Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and we're actually not taking a look at a gun today. We're taking a look at a really cool piece of World War II military history, thanks to the support of the Malta Tourism Authority. What you're looking at over my shoulder is basically the main populated center of the island of Malta. Now, Malta is located pretty much smack in the middle of the Mediterranean. It is just south of Sicily, and it was a British enclave in the work up to World War II. So this was in fact one of the main naval stations for the British Navy, the Royal Navy, during World War II. And before, during World War I, this had been an important way station for them ever since the Suez Canal opened, as it guarded and supported the trade routes between India through Egypt up to England. So what you're looking at over my shoulder is the main populated center of the island of Malta. Malta had about 250,000 inhabitants at the time, and they were mostly packed into this area around the Grand Harbor. That Grand Harbor was the site of the main British naval installation, and so there were a lot of people living here running businesses to support both the official naval installation and also just entertainment and such for sailors who were here on shore leave. So when World War II begins, in fact, the Italians begin World War II immediately in June 1940 with a bombing raid on Malta, and both the Italians and the Germans would kind of trade back and forth, bombing the island here between 1940 and 1942. Around the Grand Harbor, this area that you're looking at would become, by density and volume of ordnance, I believe actually the most heavily bombed location in all of World War II. For about 2 straight years, there were pretty much continuous bombing raids to try and knock out the British naval presence and also British air presence on the island. So it was mostly bombing around the Grand Harbor, attacking the shipping and the support facilities. However, because of the immense amount of air defense set up by the British, a lot of the bombing raids got a little less than, super accurate with their bombing, and a lot of the civilian houses in this area were destroyed. A substantial number of civilians were killed in the process. The island was under effectively siege and bombing raids for several years. So what we're going to do today is take a look at what the government of Malta and the civilian population did to try and deal with this. And that is a really cool system of underground bomb shelters. Today, specifically, we're going to take a look at a set of bomb shelter tunnels that are located below the Malta At War Museum. However, there are literally hundreds of these shelters scattered throughout the island, and there are a number of other museums and historical sites that do have tunnels open to the public. So if you are here on Malta visiting, this is one option to take a look at, and it's a pretty cool big one, but there are also several others. All right, let's get going. So all of these shelters were dug below ground. So when the bombing campaign started, it quickly became clear that this was going to be a serious problem for the civilians on Malta. And the government started recommending that people dig shelters. Now, the whole island of Malta is basically comprised of this relatively soft limestone. And the people on Malta have long experience digging in it, because all the houses here are built of stone. And in fact, all of the houses, at least in some areas, are required to have cisterns to store rainwater underneath the homes. So digging through this sort of material is something that was pretty natural to the folks on Malta. And the tools they used were pretty simple ones. As you can see here, basically all hand tools. Picks, shovels, mallets, wedges, basic, simple mining equipment. Right here, we can see a really good example of how the tunnels were actually excavated. Like, technically, what did they do? What they would do is dig basically cuts on both sides of the tunnel where the tunnel walls were going to be, and then they could remove the rock in the middle in large chunks. So that's how this was all actually cut out. And you can see the marks from pickaxes and chisels up in those cuts. This was all done by hand. There were a substantial number of skilled miners on the island because that's just how how building on Malta was done. And in addition to those men, everyone else who was available also took part. Here's another good example of the end of a tunnel still in progress. So you can see the deep cuts on the sides, a cut across the top, and then that large mass of rock in the middle would be much easier to get out. Until there were enough protective bunkers for the whole population, there were a couple other alternative measures that were suggested by the Maltese government. One of them was basically find the sturdiest table you have in your home, pile a bunch of mattresses on top of it, and take cover under that. A few other some pictures here on display of some other ad hoc shelters that people came up with. There were also recommendations to take any underground rooms you might have, and again, the houses in Malta are built of and dug into this limestone, and so a lot of people would have basement rooms or old empty cisterns that could be used as individual shelters. The basic idea was a long single corridor that then had rooms cut off to the sides. Because bombing raids could go on, especially later in the war, for literally 12 hours or more, people were accustomed to sleeping in the shelters. And so you can see here one of the communal public areas with basically bunk beds built up in the tunnels. Now these tunnels were originally put together as a public project. Before that, people were digging private shelters in their own homes. However, when the situation became critical, the Maltese government prohibited actual professional miners from working on private excavations. Instead, they were required to help out with the public shelters. These, of course, got quite crowded and had very little privacy, and people weren't particularly happy to be in here for extended periods of time. And so, after a period, the government agreed to allow people to start building their own private cubicles in the public shelters. So, the typical spacing was every 7 feet, you could dig a 6 by 6 by 6 foot little cubicle for your own family. This one's not particularly well lit. Let's move to the next one. Here we have one that's open. The wooden gates that you see on these, like that, I don't think that's an original wooden gate. However, it is a replica of what was actually used. And that was put in to allow you to have some privacy and keep some items in your shelter. For example, some religious items, a lantern, fuel for the lantern, a chair, a blanket, a bed, and that sort of things. So there's your little 6 by 6 foot private shelter. And as you can see, this entire hallway, sorry, you guys can't really see that one because of the light. Here's a better lit one. This entire hallway, this little corridor, is filled with private chambers. As the war continued, the shelters actually became remarkably expansive and started to include things like maternity rooms. So this was actually a room set up to be a maternity ward for expecting mothers, dug into the shelter itself. Not only maternity rooms, but also first aid posts and even surgical rooms. You'll notice that this room has a tiled floor and plastered walls. That was done originally to give it a more sanitary environment as necessary for, well, it didn't originally have the dehumidifier. But this would be actually a place where basic surgery could be undertaken during an air raid. Just down the hall, we have the remainder of the first aid station. You see here a little cubby in the wall for some basic medical operating supplies. And then this would be the basic first aid post. So anyone who was injured could be brought here. People who had come out of an emergency surgery would be also brought into here. Notice again, the tiling on the floor to give some effort at more hygienic conditions. Now originally, these tunnels were in fact lit electrically, like you can see here today. However, of course, air raids tend to play havoc with electrical supply. When electrical supplies went out, candles were the next source of illumination. However, Malta had actually imported most of its candles from Italy. And of course, with the Italians being some of the folks bombing the island, there wasn't a whole lot of Italian candle importation going on. So the next best alternative was actually oil lamps. Olive oil, which was available and produced on Malta, is actually a pretty darn good fuel. It's smoky and sooty, as you can see there, but a half a liter of olive oil can burn for up to 2 days with a proper wick. By November of 1941, there were actually enough shelters that had been dug to house the entire civilian population of the islands, which is really quite an incredible feat. And that's why there are so many of these shelters scattered around the island today. In total, by the end of the war, 5,500 buildings, mostly civilian, were completely destroyed. Another 5,000 plus were heavily damaged. And nearly 1,000 total shelters were built. Here is the nice little overview of this particular shelter under the Malta At War Museum. This is definitely a really cool thing to visit should you ever find yourself in Malta.